Hey, I'm Damon Garcia, bringing you perspectives from the Christian left, and today we're talking about how Rosa Luxemburg was right back in 1905 that pastors, priests, and clergy tend to choose the side of the oppressors instead of the oppressed, even today, even when they don't realize they're doing it. So let's talk about it. So this is part one of a whole series going through this important article written by Rosa Luxemburg in 1905, published by the Polish Social Democratic Party. And so let me read a quick bio here about Rosa Luxemburg. She was born 1871 in Russian Poland to a middle-class Jewish family. She was a revolutionary agitator by her teens, and then she moved to Zurich in part to avoid possible imprisonment. She studied at the University of Zurich, receiving her doctorate in 1898. From Warsaw, Luxemburg tried to help the Russian Revolution. She wrote more than 700 pamphlets, articles, speeches, and books advocating mass strikes by proletariats. She was in and out of prison once for advocating during World War I that German soldiers turn their guns upon the government and overthrow it. In 1919, she and two leaders of the German Communist Party, which Luxemburg helped found, were arrested. She was knocked out, shot, and thrown in a river. Rosa Luxemburg, why? Very tragic ending. And she's also famous for coming out against Lenin in several ways, not from a right-wing perspective of, you shouldn't be communist, but from a left-wing perspective saying, hey, yes, let's start this revolution, let's go for communism, but on your way there, please don't become like your typical authoritarian fascist government. But we're not exactly going to talk about those parts of her life, even though that's mostly what she's famous for. We're going to talk about something she wrote way before that and way before the Russian Revolution in 1905 called Socialism and the Churches. And during this time in her life, she was gathering workers in solidarity to lead mass strikes in order to stop World War I from happening, in order to stop Germany from fighting in that war. And because of that, she was arrested several times. And during this point of her life, while she was being arrested, her and her friends were being constantly criticized by the clergy, by the priests and their sermons every Sunday. And so she wrote this whole thing, 7 parts. We're going through part 1 today, and then we'll keep going throughout the rest of these videos. And she wrote this to critique, first off, the priests who she says, if you look at your entire Christian tradition, and especially when you look at Jesus, shouldn't the priests be on the side of the exploited workers and not on the side of the exploiters? And that is also a very, very urgent question today. So that's why I find this extremely relevant to talk about today. And so as I go through this and as I'm talking about it, think about how it applies to today. Think about the ways she talks about church and clergy and socialism and how it rings true today. And also, before we get into this, I just want to say my attention was actually brought to this article since it's not exactly part of her famous works. It was brought to me by the podcast The Magnificast. They did an episode where they went through their favorite bits. There's some other leftist Christians that are really great, so check out that podcast. And after I listened to that and went through this whole thing, I'm like, this whole thing needs to be talked about. And I must say, at this day in my life, I very much value the Marxist, socialist, communist ideas of Rosa Luxemburg way more than any other Marxist ideas, even of Marx himself. If I had to stuff myself aggressively inside of a box, I don't like doing that. I would rather say I'm sympathetic to all these ideas from a very, very deeply Christian point of view. I don't just fully subscribe to these ideologies just because. So that's what we're doing as we go through this. Don't think you're coming and watching some super violent communist dude. No, that's not it. So try to do the best you can to erase any ideas of what you think socialism, communism, leftism, whatever is as we go into this. And I bet you'll be a little bit surprised, especially with Rosa Luxemburg's way of approaching these ideas. So let's get into it. I'm going to read bits and let you know my commentary as we go through it. Part 1. From the moment when the workers of our country and of Russia begin to struggle bravely against the Tsarist government and the capitalist exploiters, we notice more and more often that the priests and their sermons come out against the workers who are struggling. It is with extraordinary vigor that the clergy fight against the socialists and try by all means to belittle them in the eyes of the workers. The believers who go to church on Sundays and festivals are compelled more and more often to listen to a violent political speech, a real indictment of socialism, instead of hearing a sermon and obtaining religious consolation there. Let's stop there real quick. Already, I think this rings true how so many people go to church hoping to be encouraged, hoping to learn about Jesus and how that leads to more and more life. And yet, the sermon is filled with critiques of certain groups of people. I've come across randomly on YouTube from time to time a whole sermon a pastor will do just against liberals or against social justice people, or against Black Lives Matter, or against just any group of people who are protesting and trying to change things. And it's obvious it's a whole sermon on just the idea of like, chill, don't try to change things, don't be rowdy, don't do anything. I assume. I've never clicked on any of those sermons, I've just seen the titles and thumbnails, but I get the vibe immediately. She continues, instead of comforting the people who are full of cares and wearied by their hard lives, who go to church with faith in Christianity, the priests fulminate against the workers who are on strike, and against the opponents of the government. Further, they exhort them to bear poverty and oppression with humility and patience. They turn the church and the pulpit into a place of political propaganda. Which is an interesting, somewhat ironic statement, because I'm sure so many pastors who do this even to this day are implying we're trying to make sure this isn't a place of political propaganda, so we're going to talk about how bad the people who are trying to make the places into political propaganda are, when really they're just trying to encourage people to fight for their freedom. And yet, this is totally political propaganda when they just spend their whole sermons critiquing these groups who are trying to fight for their freedom. And that's so important, where I see again and again this idea where they'd never say it straight out, but it's a very subtle message underneath all these platitudes. This idea, just bear your poverty and oppression with humility and patience. And vote when you need to. Don't try to change things. Don't try to be a rebel. Christians aren't rebels, even though when we look back at history, we often say the true Christians are the ones who fought against a government who is doing terrible violence in the world. This whole image of the leaders of the church being on the side of the powers that be, which we've seen so much, isn't really how Christianity was ever supposed to go. Christianity, ever since its birth, has always been an anti-imperial religion and tradition and way of life. And yet we often see, yeah, Jesus got that, but so many people who are preaching Jesus seem to not get it. And I would even say that several pastors and priests who give these messages today, several of them aren't really doing it on purpose. They're just used to, this is what a sermon is. This is what I'm supposed to teach every Sunday because the pastor who trained me did it and the pastor before him did too. Let's keep going. The workers can easily satisfy themselves that the struggle of the clergy against the Social Democrats is in no way provoked by the latter. Now, she often refers to her group as the Social Democrats, and I just want to make this distinction real quick. When she says Social Democrats, at the time the Social Democratic Party was very different. It was gathering workers to try to get a revolution going that would eventually lead to socialism and even communism. But ultimately, when the revolution came, the Social Democratic Party just ended up being on the side of capitalism and killed Rosa Luxemburg. And then that has just stayed the MO of the Social Democratic Party ever since in all kinds of countries. That's just always how it ends up. When things get tough, the Social Democrats just choose the side of capitalism and don't really want to ruffle any feathers. And that today is what Social Democrats are. They're not really trying to end capitalism or headed for socialism at all. They want to keep capitalism intact, but just create several social programs. So I just want to make that clear so that when I'm reading this, you don't think either, why is she praising the Social Democrats? Aren't they the ones that killed her? that's later in life. And I want to make that distinction if you're thinking, oh, so social democrats today are socialists? Nah. So when I say social democrats, in this case only, think in your head socialists. Anyway, the social democrats have placed themselves the objective of drawing together and organizing the workers in the struggle against capital, that is to say, against the exploiters who squeeze them down to the last drop of blood, and in the struggle against the Tsarist government, which holds the people to ransom. But never do the Social Democrats drive the workers to fight against clergy or try to interfere with religious beliefs. Not at all. The Social Democrats, those of the whole world and of our own country, regard conscience and personal opinions as being sacred. Every man may hold what faith and what opinions seems likely to him to ensure happiness. No one has the right to persecute or to attack the particular religious opinion of others. That is what the socialists think. So, let's make this real clear. I know several people who, a big reason why they immediately look down on socialist ideas or Marxist ideas is because they immediately say, oh, those are the people who are against Christianity. Those are the people who want a world or a government where they get rid of Christianity, where they outlaw Christianity or all religion in general. No, I know there's several Marxist thinkers who did talk like that. Rosa Luxemburg, who was an atheist, didn't talk like that. She recognized that personal opinions and beliefs and conscience were sacred, and we should create a society where everyone is free to have the beliefs that they want, even if that's Christianity, and they should continue to do their thing, as long as they're not using their power to go against the workers and be on the side of the oppressors. She goes on, and it is for that reason, among others, that the socialists rally all the people to fight against the Tsarist regime, which is continually violating men's consciences, persecuting Catholics, Russian Catholics, Jews, heretics, and freethinkers. It is precisely the Social Democrats who come out mostly strongly in favor of freedom of conscience. Therefore, it would seem as if the clergy ought to lend their help to the Social Democrats who are trying to enlighten the toiling people. If we understand properly the teachings which the socialists bring to the working class, the hatred of clergy towards them becomes still less understandable. And that's what she's going at throughout this whole thing of, like, not saying, look how terrible the clergy are, but hey, this whole thing that the clergy is doing is not understandable when we look at the tradition they come from. The Social Democrats propose to put an end to the exploitation of the toiling people by the rich. You would have that the servants of the church would have been the first to make this task easier for the Social Democrats. Yes, I've often heard that plenty of times when it comes to any social justice or justice issue in general. Like, the Christians, the ones who believe that this whole world is sacred and including everyone and everything in it, shouldn't they be like the first people to care about a particular justice issue? And yet, so often, it's like they're the last. So that's the point she's making here, back in 1905. Did Jesus Christ, whose servants the priests are, teach that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? Yes, he did say that. The Social Democrats try to bring about in all countries social regimes based on the equality, liberty, and fraternity of all the citizens. If the clergy really desire that the principle love thy neighbor as thyself be applied in real life, why do they not welcome keenly the propaganda of the Social Democrats? The Social Democrats try by a desperate struggle, by the education and organization of the people, to draw them out of the downtrodden state in which they now are and to offer a better future to their children. Everyone should admit that at this point the clergy should bless the Social Democrats. For did not he whom they serve, Jesus Christ, say that you do for the poor, you do for me? Yeah, Jesus did say that. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And you'd think people who follow that kind of guy would therefore first and foremost care for the poor and the downtrodden and the least of these and try their best to bring them up and condemn everyone and everything that's trying to bring them down. However, we see the clergy on the one hand excommunicating and persecuting the Social Democrats, and on the other hand commanding the workers to suffer in patience, that is, to let themselves patiently be exploited by the capitalists. The clergy storm against the Social Democrats, exhort the workers not to revolt against the overlords, but to submit obediently to the oppression of this government, which kills defenseless people, which sends to the monstrous butchery of the war millions of workers, which persecutes Catholics, Russian Catholics, and old believers. Thus the clergy, which makes itself the spokesman of the rich, the defender of exploitation and oppression, places itself in flagrant contradiction to the Christian doctrine. The bishops and the priests are not the propagators of Christian teaching, but the worshippers of the golden calf and of the knout which whips the poor and defenseless. Yeah. It's pretty powerful stuff, and I've seen again and again, just hearing stories, but also seeing for myself, pastors preach this idea whenever something happens, whenever a certain group is treated unjustly, somehow the pastors aren't on the side of the group that was treated unjustly. It's like a person of color is shot, and then there's a Black Lives Matter protest, and then the next Sunday the pastor says, let's all pray for our brave police out there. Way before they would ever say, let's all pray for the people who are being shot by the police. Or let's all pray for our soldiers out there who are fighting for our country, without ever praying for the innocent civilians that our country is guilty of killing every day. I'm not saying pray for one group and don't pray for the other, but I'm saying, why are you only praying for the group that is doing the violence and not for the groups that are having violence done to them? So ridiculous when you actually read the New Testament, when you actually read about the life and teachings of Jesus. So ridiculous. And that's the realization that Rosa Luxemburg is making here too, as a Jewish atheist. She goes on, again, everyone knows how the priests themselves make profit from the worker, extract money out of him on the occasion of marriage, baptism, or burial. How often has it happened that the priest, called to the bedside of a sick man to administer the last sacraments, refused to go there before he had been paid his fee? The worker goes away in despair to sell or pawn his last possession so as to be able to give religious consolation to his kindred. Now, today, of course, those things, such as marriage and burial, it doesn't always have to be done by the church these days, so it's a little bit easier on people, but when they had a monopoly over those things and they would charge a large fee on families who were poor and couldn't afford it but felt like they had to do it through the church in order to be on God's good side. Terrible, terrible. Alright, last paragraph. Here's a little somewhat disclaimer. It is true that we do meet churchmen of another kind. There exist some who are full of goodness and pity and who do not seek gain. These are always ready to help the poor. Yes, there's several great pastors, priests, ministers out there who are not in it for themselves, who are not on the side of the oppressors, who really are on the side of the poor and the downtrodden and are doing good. And she says, but we must admit that these are indeed uncommon, and that they can be regarded in the same way as white blackbirds. The majority of priests with beaming faces bow and scrape to the rich and powerful, silently pardoning them for every depravity, every iniquity. With the workers, the clergy behave quite otherwise. They think only of squeezing them pity. In harsh sermons, they condemn the covetous of the workers, when these latter do no more than defend themselves against the wrongs of capitalism. It's like they hear their people say, it's messed up how the government is doing this to us. It's messed up how we are stuck in this terrible situation while there are people over there who are way richer and are exploiting our people, and the pastors and priests are like, hey, that's covetousness. Hey, don't be jealous and envious of others. Yeah, The glaring contradiction between the actions of the clergy and teachings of Christianity must make everyone reflect. The workers wonder how it comes about that the working class in its struggle for emancipation find in the servants of the church enemies and not allies. How does it happen that the church plays the role of a defense of wealth and bloody oppression instead of being the refuge of the exploited? In order to understand this strange phenomenon, it is sufficient to glance over the history of the church and to examine the evolution through which it has passed in the course of the centuries. So then, and that leads to part 2, where she goes through the history of the early church, talks about how did we get here, was it always this way, how did it change? So we'll get into that in the next video when we go through part 2, but that's it for part 1. And I just want to reiterate again, yes, there are several ministers out there, several church people out there, Christians out there who are doing what they should do, who really are following the ways of Jesus, who really are on the side of the poor and the oppressors, who really do believe whatever you do for the least of these, you're doing for Jesus. One of the people that comes to mind is Phil Snyder. He's a pastor in Springfield, Missouri, with the denomination Disciples of Christ. And after Charlottesville, him and several other ministers in the area came out and released a statement against the alt-right and white supremacy, while several other pastors across the country either said nothing about it or were just condemning, like Trump, there's bad people and good people on both sides. But I know several of them just said nothing. So yes, there are ministers who are telling the truth, who are on the side of the poor and the downtrodden, the least of these. We just need way more. I'm not against the church. I'm not against pastors and Christian leaders in any way, no way. I just recognize how the church needs to change and what we can do better. And I am a part of the church and I am a Christian fully, but we just can do so much better. I left my position as a youth and young adults minister about 1.5 years ago now, and one of the reasons I left was this stuff. I left because of several disagreements with the doctrine of my denomination, and the doctrines that I disagreed with are the same for several evangelical denominations. It wasn't exactly my problem with that particular denomination. Leaving that denomination very much felt like I was leaving all of evangelicalism. And one of the disagreements I had among several was that as I've read and studied and researched and gone through my own spiritual journey, learning more and more about Jesus and trying to be more like Jesus, has led me to be more and more anti-capitalist. I think of Pope Francis when he said in his work, The Joy of the Gospel, when he said that just like we're people who say, thou shalt not kill, we should also say the same thing for systems that kill. And these systems kill through poverty. And even though so many churches out there are like, of course we care about poverty, of course we want to help poor people and we'll donate money and we'll be a help to charities and do anything we can with that, yet they don't want to question the system that makes poor people in general. Reminds me of this famous quote by Dom Helder Camara when he said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." And like I said at the beginning, this isn't about trying to convert anyone socialist or communist or Marxist ideas. No. Rather, I'm trying to do what Rosa said here, to just think about this. The glaring contradiction between the actions of the clergy and teachings of Christianity must make everyone reflect. So as I go through this, and hopefully you stick with me throughout it, I just want you to stop and reflect. Because before we get any real work done, we're going to have to really think about what we're doing here. And together come, and once we all realize there's a problem, then we could do something about it. But I guess part of my work also is just trying to get people to realize, yo, there's a problem, and it's way worse than you may think. Thank you for watching. Leave a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more. And hopefully I see you over in part 2 as we go through this document, Socialism in the Churches, by the lovely Rosa Luxemburg.